Hi, I'm Ben, welcome to my book corner, and today is my reading wrap up for March of 2025. We'll start off with a couple of my stats from the month before going into each of the books briefly, and then finishing off on a couple of little channel bits. So with that being said, let's dive into the Stortygraph stats. So the stats on Stortygraph are actually slightly out for this month, but we did manage to complete 6 books in total with a page count of 1,510, which is slightly down on last month, and I have 13.35 hours of audiobook. Mentioning the audiobook here, that is The Great Hunt, which is book 2 in the Wheel of Time. That's not going to be part of this wrap up because I'm only halfway through right now, as the audiobook length is around 28 hours, but I wanted to mention that here. In terms of what I read, we had 2 fantasy and 2 horror, as well as 1 historical fiction and 1 contemporary fiction as well. It does actually have the split of digital and print wrong. For some reason on Stortygraph it's automated some of them to print when they were ebook, and part of that is because all the books that I've completed this month have actually been user added to Stortygraph, so not added by authors or publishers, because they are all indie or self-published this month. So in actual fact, it was 1 physical book and 5 ebooks. And as you can see off in the graph of when I read, my reading has been all over the place this month. I'm slightly surprised I got over 1,000 pages, because up until around about the 20th, I was nowhere near. But that's the stats. Let's dive into the books. First up was Bloodstains by Gaslight, written by Lagoe. This was actually a arc that I received through Book Sirens, and oddly enough was my 3rd vampire book in a row, following on from last month's Ashes of the Star-Cursed King and Reality Bites. Despite sounding like it might be some form of Victoriana horror, the gaslight in this refers to the psychological gaslighting of a partner, and that is the central core of this story, with Reese in her last year of seniors and desperate to get out of small-town America and follow her dream of working in astronomy. However, she's in an abusive and toxic relationship with Michael, who has become increasingly manipulative and abusive over time. However, after Michael has an accident and is saved by a mysterious stranger, things take an unusual turn. Becoming endowed with some supernatural abilities and an almost predator-like obsession, Michael becomes even less human than he was before, and far, far more dangerous. This was actually really good. It is worth checking the content warnings for this, however. With physical and psychological abuse, SA, blood, violence and murder all included in here. And this does an amazing job of getting to the humanity of all the characters, including Michael, who is determined not to become the person that his father was, but seems to be stuck on that path. The ebook for this comes in at 247 pages. This was a very solid 4 stars for me. Change of gears now, and we're on to Orla, Raffety Seeks Her Fortune. This is book 1 in a series by Margaret Pennard. Margaret was very kind to come onto the channel, and we had a chat about this book and writing in general. If you want to check that interview out, I shall link it above. And I will also link Margaret's YouTube channel down below. An amazing human being. I highly recommend you check their channel out. This story follows Orla, who is a widow following the death of their husband, and takes place in 1833 in the UK, largely around Scotland, just outside of Glasgow, but it does hop a little bit around the country, as Orla seeks to educate herself in terms of some of the investments that have been made in her name since her husband's death. Set during a time of great inequality, this takes an unflinching look at some of the challenges that Orla faces as a woman trying to get in on some of the very male-dominated sections of industry, as well as dealing with the multitudes of political corruption that existed at the time, as well as a period of reconnecting with family. It's clear to see how much effort went into the research of this, and this actually does at times link into some history that's local to me here in Manchester. and does a good job of showing some of Orla's struggles as well as some of the great opportunities that were potentially around at the time if you could overcome some of the challenges. Overall, I gave this as well 4 stars. Next one is one that is well outside my normal reading comfort zone. This is 13 by H. Ferdosy. This is a contemporary fiction / thriller set in Iran. This is dual POV, although the majority of it is told from the point of view of Neda, who comes round from a coma to find out both of her parents and her fiancé are dead, with her fiancé being executed for their murder. This follows Neda's quest for the truth and then justice and ultimately vengeance, struggling in a highly unequal society once again. This is very, very dark. Neda themselves are from quite a privileged family in many regards and is quite naive of the world in general. And this takes an unflinching look at some of the biases and abuses that take place in Iran towards various different parts of society, but women in particular. What really stood out about this one was the way it was structured and the way it was written. The timeline of this does jump around a bit and it almost reads like a journal in many regards. And unlike some other books where I ended up getting slightly lost with the time jumps in the narrative, this works really, really well in the way that it's structured, as it does switch between the different time periods, primarily of Neda's life. It's a dark read, it's quite an uncomfortable read at times as well with some of the things that happens, and this is not a story that has a happy ending by any stretch of the imagination, but this is exceptionally well written. Thrillers and mysteries, not generally my thing. I am glad, however, that I read this one. Also, thank you so much to What Amy Reads over on X for recommending this one to me. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I know from speaking to you when you were starting it, you were having a great time with the writing on this one. Again, I gave this one 4 stars. It comes in at 496 pages as well, so this was the chunker for the month. I needed a bit of fantasy after that one, and we hit The Whisper That Replaced God Part 2, Silent Almighty by Timothy Wolff. This came out on March 21st. I read this on March 21st. It's a novella at 78 pages and is obviously a follow-up to The Whisper That Replaced God. And we continue following the character of Mute, who is now king after he assassinated his brother and the previous one. Gifted with the power to silence those around him, and having a period of time on the throne, things have not gone well for his subjects or his kingdom when an usurper appears to arrive with talks of a cult in the area and the new Lord Death, who intends to replace Lord Muse as the scream that replaces the whisper. Mute continues to be great fun to read, as well as incredibly unreliable as the story's narrator. This has some very dark moments, some very human moments as well, but there's plenty of humour laced in here also. Once again as well, there are a couple of little pops at big business here, specifically one that we shall call Rainforest, which I always appreciate. I will say I probably do actually prefer part 1, but that's not a knock on this one. I gave this 4.25 stars out of 5. Next up is another book that shows that X sometimes has a use. This is an arc that I requested and was lucky enough to receive, although I didn't realise that I had received it because for some reason it went to my spam box, so I hit this later in the month than I intended to. This is Whispers of the Storm by Z.B. Steele, which is book 1 of the new Song of the Damned series. This came out on March 25th. I did receive this as an arc, so worth mentioning in here. This might be my favourite read of the year so far. This is the story of Redlin of the Wolves, as told by Redlin of the Wolves, currently incarcerated and being transported across the country. Redlin is recounting the true tale of his life to an inquisitor. This largely covers the early years of Redlin's life, starting off when he was a child before the education he received in military matters and eventually magic as well, on the early part of their life to becoming a vanguard. Generally speaking, this largely takes place, I should say, in Redlin's past, but does fast forward to brief moments of current day as he's interacting with the Inquisitor and sharing his story. And this is where we get some real foreshadowing of some other things that have happened. It's very clear that at some point Redlin was some great hero until he was no longer needed, and now he's seen as a threat. This did something that very, very few books managed to do. This transported me back to my early days of reading fantasy when I was reading Brooks or Gemmell for the first time in particular. This is just such a well-told story with some great foreshadowing for what is to come, some truly world-shattering events. This is an easy 5-star read for me. If you're looking for a new up-and-coming indie fantasy, I highly recommend you check this one out. It comes in at 402 pages long. It is available on Kindle Unlimited, and to be honest, it's dirt cheap to buy on there as well. This is one where I will be buying a physical copy to have on my shelf. That is Whispers of the Storm by Z.B. Steele. Rounding out the month, I have another gifted book. This is from the author, Barbara Avon. Thank you so much for reaching out. This was revived, so this was first released in March of 2022. This is a horror novella coming in at 105 pages on the ebook edition, which you can get from Kindle, and also you can buy physical as well. This follows Stephen and Cassie. They are a couple who have recently become married, and they have gone out to celebrate Stephen getting a pay rise for his amazing performance at work. It's worth noticing right here and now that both of these characters have more than their fair share of skeletons in their closet. And when Stephen is struck by a car following the celebration, he actually dies for a full 60 seconds. At first, I wasn't quite clear what was going on here. It looked like everything was linked to Cassie until we started to get some of the backstory for Stephen, and this was actually really, really well done. The tagline of "he should have stayed dead" really does sit with this one really, really well. This was a really strong novella. I gave this 4 stars out of 5. So that just leaves us with some channel stats. First off, for some reading comparison, last year I read 9 books, this year I read 6, and this year's page count was 1,510 for completed books, whereas last year was 3,507, so I read considerably less this year, although it is worth mentioning that a number of my books for March last year were graphic novels. In terms of channel content, this year we had 2 videos, one being reading wrap-up for February, one being a book haul, and the author interview with the amazing Margaret Pinard, which you can find at the top if you want to go and check that out. This is versus last year when we had 7 videos, which included 4 reviews, 1 tag video, 1 wrap-up video, and a look at my failed read what you own challenge. So a bit less content made this year. In terms of channel numbers, this year we had 634 views during March versus last year of 489, which is an increase of 29.4%. And also in terms of watch time, we had 48.2 hours this year versus 27.4 last year, which is an increase of 75%, largely driven by the live with Margaret. We gained 5 subscriptions in March this year versus 12 last year, which realistically is largely down to the lack of content that I've made during March of 2025, with a total amount of impressions of 21,513, which is up 41% on last year, which was 15,164. Finally, click-through rate is relatively normal for me at 1.8% versus 2.3% last year, so a small drop, but nothing particularly concerning. And finally, my most viewed video, interestingly enough, was not one that I released this month, but was my audio read for Chapter 1 of Lost Boy by Christina Henry. If you want to check that out, that is linked at the top as well. So despite a lack of me making content this month, numbers don't look too bad. If you've made it this far, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please consider giving it a thumbs up, and let me know in the comments down below what your favourite read of March 2025 was. Thank you so much for watching and listening, I will hopefully catch some of you very soon.